Everybody, and thank you very much for joining our online book launch of Weapons of the Rich. First of all, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Professor Dr. Gunther Schubert and Professor Dr. Thomas Heberer. Professor Dr. Schubert holds a chair for Greater China Studies and also serves as Vice Director of the Institute of Asian and Oriental Studies at the University of Tübingen, to name only a few of his many functions. Among other fields of research, Professor Dr. Schubert studies policy implementation in contemporary China from the perspective of steering theory, with a focus on private sector reform and the evolution of state-business relations, particularly in China's local state. Professor Dr. Heberer holds the chair of political science, with emphasis on East Asia studies at the University of Duisburg-Essen, and has been functioning as a co-director at the Confucius Institute of Metropolis Ruhr in Duisburg for over 10 years now. His fields of research include processes, patterns, and protagonists of the political and social development in China. Due to their exceeding knowledge, regular stays in China, and fast network, both are regarded as leading experts in their field, which reflects distinctly in the new title Weapons of the Rich. This webinar will run for an hour, consisting of Professor Dr. Schubert's and Professor Dr. Hebeler's talk and a Q&A session. Before I finally hand over to our authors, I'd like to mention our housekeeping rules, which are that we would kindly ask you to keep your camera and microphone off for the entire duration of the event. If you have any question, you may post them to the authors directly in our Q&A session right after the talk by using the hand-raising function. And finally, please note that this webinar will be recorded, and the recording may be shared publicly online, for example, on our social media pages. So I hand over to our authors.
Yeah, thank you, Regina, and welcome everybody. We are very happy to have this opportunity for this book launch. To introduce to you very briefly a very long project, which actually started back in 2012 already and went on for about 6 years, gathering data on state-business relations, particularly private entrepreneurs, political agency in the local state. And the driving force of that project was our thinking and our observations on private sector reform in China on the one hand, and the social constituency. We knew that there were important Western studies based on data of the 1990s and the early 2000s, and we were very much interested in understanding how state-business relations evolved over time. So that is a book with data which is new, covering a long period, and probably being the richest data, qualitative data in Western language, at least so far gathered up to this point of time. Now, our research questions basically on the first slide. We wanted to understand how private entrepreneurs in contemporary China engage in collective action to safeguard their respective interests. We wanted to understand to what extent they developed a collective identity that would also help them to engage in strategic action. There was also the consideration to observe to what extent they could change the institutional environment in contemporary China, and how in the end they would contribute to the stabilization of the system, as it was established wisdom for the time being that private entrepreneurs wouldn't be a system and antagonizing force, but very much stabilizing the system. And we wanted to check on the base of more recent data if that was still true. Next slide. Next slide, please. So from the onset, we contend that private entrepreneurs are constituting a strategic group that pursues their interests via uncoordinated strategic action. And the notion of uncoordinated strategic action is important with reference to the analytical framework we placed the project on. Next slide. Probably for those of you who followed our work over the recent past, you might know that we have very much written on strategic groups in different settings. particularly with respect to private entrepreneurs in recent years. So this is an analytical concept that connects to rational bound institutionalism, or you can say actor-centered institutionalism, an approach to analyze strategic action by specific social constituencies. And we have applied that to local cadres in the Chinese local state already, but we did it now with reference to private entrepreneurs. Next slide. I wouldn't refer too much to this analytical framework. There is one chapter in the book, chapter 3, which comprehensively explains the different components of that concept. The only thing that I want to say is that we purposely applied or systematically applied that concept throughout the book. So the notion of shared interest, strategic agency, and collective identity are very important to understand a strategic group. Next slide. We have tied in Scott's work, as you may see from the title, Weapons of the Rich. We have also engaged other scholars in order to understand our basic theoretical premise, which means that there is strategic action on the part of private entrepreneurs throughout China, though it is not coordinated. Most people would contend that you can only speak about a politically relevant group if there is some level of coordinated strategic action across space and across time. But we contend that there is strategic action also in a so-called uncoordinated fashion. Next slide. And we do this with reference to Olson and others who speak of a so-called large number effect and a we intention, which means if you have throughout China, which is a very, very big country, the same social constituency in functional terms, but in different localities, pursuing the same interests and, developing the same traits of an identity, you can speak of a strategic group that may not be coordinated nationally, but by the simple fact that they all act in one direction with the same motivation, the same interests, makes them a strategic group that also affects the whole political system. Next slide. So it's yours, Thomas.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm happy to discuss with you the issue, the content of our books, and I will focus on the empirical findings, particularly the domains or channels of collective strategic action. Next slide. This map shows in principle where we conducted fieldwork between 2012 and 2018, altogether 30 locations in 11 provinces, focusing on the northeast, the east, the southeast, and the southwest of China. So except the western part of China. Next slide. Actually, we address in our book 3 dimensions of strategic collective action: the formal collective action, informal collective action, and connective action. That means by means of the cyberspace. Next slide. Formal collective action you are more familiar with, probably. It refers to the acting of private entrepreneurs in the official organizations, such as the People's Congresses at all levels, political consultative conferences and party congresses, and of course on the chambers of commerce, industrial, trade, and entrepreneurial associations, and which is specific for China, the entrepreneurial hometown associations. And finally, on the Communist Party and non-communist parties. Next slide. Informal organizations are rather relating to networks, and I will give you a brief example in the next slide, to alumni organizations such as the Changjiang MBA alumni organization, which is a very strong one, or the Tsinghua Entrepreneurial Society. Clubs and circle refers to specific online and offline clubs of entrepreneurs, such as Zhenghedao or the Taishan Entrepreneurial Club, and online organizations are mainly or primarily existing online and rarely offline. Next slide. I selected here, when it comes the presentation of a female entrepreneur in Qingdao City, which informed us of which network she is a member. And I classified these educational alumni networks, political networks, entrepreneurial networks, and other networks, such as the Fujian Hometown Association, because she originates from Fujian province. And I will make this more precise in the next slide. That needs a long time. Yeah. So she informed me how she's acting within these various channels of entrepreneurial representation and presentation. On the one hand, she is a member of the People's Political Consultative Conference of Qingdao City, which is a deliberate organization. The people, or the delegates in these People's Political Consultative Conferences are appointed by the Federation of Industry and Commerce of Qingdao City. This federation is a state-led, state-controlled organization, one of the most influential one, and particularly the more influential entrepreneurs are a member of this federation. And this federation actually is working under the United Front Department of Qingdao Party Committee. So she argues that via this channel, she has a direct access to the Qingdao Party Committee. The second one, she is not a member, or she was not a member of the Communist Party, but of one of the non-communist parties which are officially permitted, the China National Democratic Construction Association, which has a membership of about 60,000 people, primarily private entrepreneurs. And she argued, since this party is a relatively small party, she has direct access to the provincial leadership of this party and even to the national leadership of this party. And the national leader, the president of this China National Democratic Construction Association, is the vice president of the People's Political Consultative Conference of the national level, and therefore on the level of the vice prime premier of China, a very high level. And so she argues via this channel, she has also an access to the central leadership. Then she is an alumni of the primary school October 1st. And this primary and middle school before the Cultural Revolution was a school of high military leaders on the general rank, and have until today a very strong networks organization, which is very prominent and has a lot of impact in China. Further on, she's a member of the Qingdao Female Entrepreneurs Association, and thus she argues has access to the Women's Federation. She's a member of the Chinese Youth Federation, and thus she argues access to the Communist Youth League. And finally, she is a member of the Qingdao Entrepreneurs Club, which is a club of the larger and more influential entrepreneurs in Qingdao City, and has also access to these people. And she told me, according to the issues, the interests she wants to represent, or even to realize, she selects one of these organizations, or even is switching between these organizations, but not to represent their own private interests or its own enterprise interests, but rather to represent the interests of her peers. Next slide. The third channel and the final channel is this connective action. Connective action is related to the internet, to online activities. As all of you know, smartphones are the most effective tool, not only to connect ordinary people, but also to connect entrepreneurs. And by means of their Weixin chat groups, these entrepreneurs are creating what I call communication communities across localities, and they are creating e-communities of interest. So we find by means of this cyberspace new types of network building and interest representation, and they are even coordinating offline activities by means of their Weixin chat groups. Next slide. I just give you an impression, so I take a quote from one of our interviews to underscore this issue of the cyberspace organization. And this entrepreneur, he told us, by means of the internet, we can regulate more issues among ourselves at a distance from the government. Our online networks also promote mutual support and collaboration in terms of investment, marketing, enterprise mergers, business advice, and credits. By means of the internet, we like to take things in our own hands and to represent ourselves. Next slide. A second example is the entrepreneur Huang Ming in Dezhou City, a prefectural city in Shandong province. And Huang Ming is the biggest entrepreneur in Dezhou. And in 2018, he wrote a public letter put it on his Weixin account to the party secretary of Dezhou, complaining in the name of all private enterprises that the state, the government, the city government, and the city authorities are not taking care of their problems and do nothing to help them to solve these problems. Although they promised it since a decade. And he put this letter also on his blogging platform and sent it out to his various entrepreneurial Weixin groups. So it became very prominent among the ordinary public, but also among his peers, among entrepreneurs, and made its way into the national print media. And thus it put a lot of pressure on the party secretary of Dezhou City. And finally, he responded positively and ordered the authorities to communicate with local entrepreneurs. So this shows that via online, probably you have one new option in order to try to influence policies. Next slide. So discourse mobilization through online connectivity. Entrepreneurs in many regards figure as opinion leaders, so-called DAWIs, which is a form of a personalized public action. They are speaking not only for their individual interests, but as a rule, in the interest of other entrepreneurs, and not only addressing issues of concern for the entrepreneurs, but also for society in general. And of course, they try to propagate positive entrepreneurial behavior in the terms of corporate social responsibility or charity activities. And one issue which I found very tricky is that, say, in 2018, a financial private entrepreneur from Shanghai triggered a big discussion on the future of the private sector. He wrote on his blog, which was a very prominent blog in China, that now it was time that the private sector should retreat and the state-owned sector should advance. We do not know whether he did this deliberately or occasionally, but this blogging entry triggered a large discussion within not only among the public, but particularly among intellectuals who are concerned with the private sector. And finally, in November 2018, Xi Jinping had to organize a conference inviting major private entrepreneurs and openly and publicly to explain that the private sector policies would not change and the state would still strongly support the private sector. Next slide. This is my last slide, and my argumentation is that private entrepreneurs are not a driving force of political change, but a driving force of institutional change. On the one side, they shape private sector policies, various formal, informal, and connective channels, and trigger a kind of a legislation to protect private entrepreneurs. They're also creating alternative channels of lending and corporate finance. Take, for instance, these private credit associations among entrepreneurs themselves. They are, on the other hand, competing with state-owned enterprises, but they are expanding into new industrial and service sectors, and they are striving for discourse supremacy. Take, for instance, the China Entrepreneurs Forum, organized by some of the biggest entrepreneurs in China, which is discussing not private policy issues, not private entrepreneurial policy issues, but also issues of national and global interest, and which is attended by central leaders. And finally, the private sector is encouraging policy innovation. Now I give back to Gunther.
So again, reminding of our point of departure. We didn't set out to make any revolutionary findings in the first place, but we tried to understand what may have changed in state-business relations since the early 2010s, as all the data we had up to that point were much older. And we wanted to know if there was any change in what we call the regime coalition in China between party-state elites and private entrepreneurs. So first of all, our conclusions are that private entrepreneurs, no matter where you look at China, in the north, in the west, in the south, they pursue their interests strategically. They pursue it very often collectively, though not often coordinated across space. They increasingly display a collective identity in the sense of being aware that private entrepreneurs are a social constituency that may become politically powerful, or at least which has the potential to be a political factor in the local state, as so many local governments depend on the private sector. Also, the private entrepreneurs we interviewed, some 150 over those years, had no intention to challenge the party state and still were thickly embedded in the political regime. But we found that, and that's part of the next slide, there was a change apparently in the internal relationship between party states, elite, and private entrepreneurs. And they also partook in institutional change. That is a matter which we have not elaborated on very specifically in the book. We have examples here, but that was not our main focus, to concentrate on all the, the impact that private entrepreneurs had on institutional change. We more looked at the processes of strategic action. Next slide. So private entrepreneurs, we found, still stabilize the system. They display very often a fair amount of patriotism. We found that it's not always ideologically driven, though you cannot exclude that there is also some sort of ideological mimicry out there. They are doing their best to improve the system's institutional structure, which means that they are very focused by private sector reforms and their support for private sector reforms, but also corporate social responsibility measures and poverty alleviation to make the system function better, because that also safeguards their interests. So there is a mutual relationship in there, in this coalition interaction or interrelationship. They also certainly contribute to local, regional, and national development. So that makes them important for the party state, no matter to what extent they are also discriminated against. There is an objective fact that the relative importance of private entrepreneurs in China is increasing. And they also have a tendency to solve their problems in a certain distance from the party state, because they also want to avoid the state, which is interfering, not always directly interfering, but which is also exerting pressure on private entrepreneurs. And there is a tendency, if it is ever possible, to stay away from the state. Next slide. So we contend, that's one of our basic findings, and that can be discussed, of course, that by our observations, and of course they are much more described in detail described in the book, display a certain horizontalization of party state elite private entrepreneur relations, which means that this embedded group is in a way stronger than it had been. This is also a common sense argument, because if you look at the increasing importance of the private sector, that also inheres that private entrepreneurs as a social constituency must be more important wherever they act. And the fact that the Xi Jinping government does exert more pressure on private entrepreneurs apparently over the last years also displays this fact that apparently they have more power whatsoever and more influence on the political system. And another matter, what I just said, there is also tendencies to strive for more autonomy, though each and every entrepreneur we talk to were very much aware that it's impossible to escape the regime. So you are forced to have a certain relationship to the regime, but there is also a clear inclination to stay away from it if ever possible. Next slide. So there are a couple of questions, of course. We have observed, as you know, if you're working in this field, that there is a new endeavor on the part of the regime to incorporate private entrepreneurs into the party state. That's what we may call Xi Jinping State Capitalism 2.0, which at first instance is an effort to strengthen state-owned enterprises vis-a-vis the private sector, but not in the sense to destroy the private sector, but to absorb the private sector. And we have observed many different settings or also institutional arrangements where the party state wants to make that possible. An example would be local asset associations or investment associations where state-owned companies and also big private stakeholders set up huge capital assets to buy private companies. So this is a way of reorganizing Chinese capitalism in better incorporating private entrepreneurs and binding them to the party state. As I said before, that also points at the fact that there may be sort of an autonomization strategy or tendency within the sector, this strategic group, that forces more or less or pushes the Xi Jinping regime to exert more power over them. And the question that also raises from our book, we think, is that if there is a recalibration of power relations in the regime coalition that is covered up by this new pressure on private entrepreneurs in China, so what is that going to result in? Will there be a new wave of crony capitalism in China over time? Because if private entrepreneurs stay within the regime coalition but become more powerful, then they may also have the potential to, let's say, change the system according to their own interests. Or is it that because the party state under Xi Jinping is a strong state and Xi Jinping is a strong man, pushing back against that rising power of private entrepreneurs?
Oh. Yeah. Das ist bei mir weg. Bei wem ist das? Hello?
I think we have a problem with Professor Schubert's connection.
Okay.
Professor Heberer, could you maybe jump in? Or
I think in principle, because we are running out of time, so we could start with the question and answers.
Yeah, of course. So if somebody would already like to comment on the questions Professor Dr. Schubert just asked, or pose another question to the authors, you may use the Zoom function to raise your hand and I will unmute you. So you can speak to the authors directly.
You also welcome comments, of course, not only questions.
Yeah, exactly. So we have no questions so far. Maybe Professor Dr. Heberer or Professor Dr. Schubert may
answer our open questions.
Yeah, exactly. May talk a bit about your open questions.
Yeah, okay. When I take the first question, does Xi Jinping State Capitalism 2.0 successfully push back against the weapon of the rich? Of course, this depends. On the one hand, the Chinese state and Xi Jinping as currently the leader have the power to push back the private sector if he attempts to develop in a wrong direction or another direction. This on the one hand. But on the other hand, the Chinese leadership and the Chinese regime is dependent on the private sector. after the Corona crisis, this became highly seeable. For instance, since Prime Minister Li Keqiang, during the session of the National People's Congress, suddenly explained that it would now be possible for the informal sector, that means the small food stalls and repair people, to come back into downtown of the cities, because they wanted to create new jobs in a very rapid time. And the informal sector, which was thrown out of the downtown city or from the city centers, now returns, at least in some of the cities. So from the perspective of employment, and from the perspective of tax payment, and from the perspective of innovations, I would argue that the private sector is indispensable in order to achieve the primary goal of the Xi Jinping leadership. That means until 2050 to become a comprehensively modernized entity on par with the United States. Of course, the state is very strong now, so that he can control the private sector in any regards. And we classify the Chinese state as a developmental state, which means also one part of this concept of developmental state, that we find a strong symbiosis between the state on the one side, on the one hand, and the enterprise on the other hand, but it's a kind of asymmetric interrelationship. So in the end, the Chinese state or the government or the party state are deciding in which direction the private sector should develop. Gunda, are you going to address the second question?
I'm very sorry, I was briefly thrown out of Zoom, as you may have seen. I hope that you could listen to my last remarks before I was pushed out, but I'm back now and ready for questions.
We just decided that we first, because there were no questions, that we first address our 3 questions we raised, and I just tried to answer the first one. Now your turn to go to the second one.
So the second question is exactly what? What kind of question are we referring to now?
Will the recalibration of power relations in the regime entail crony capitalism?
Yeah, so this is a discussion that is arising from our book, though we do not really ponder that question too much. I mean, Pei Mingxin has written a big book, and he's perfectly written that side of the story, digged out all the corrupt behavior of private entrepreneurs, and then making a connection to dysfunctional problems within the party-state system. More or less saying that private entrepreneurs make use of that specific political system in order to safeguard their interests by all means. And that means that there is a constant tendency to crony capitalism in China that is fought against by the Xi Jinping government, that sees that danger as well and does everything to fight corruption in order to stabilize the regime's legitimacy. So the point is, there is a tension here. You have a strong party state. You have a lot of power on the part of the party to suppress private entrepreneurs, but you're also systematically and strategically dependent on the private sector. And so if you fight against crony capitalism, you also fight against private entrepreneurs. You may fight against the private sector per se, and you may decapacitate your state capacity or what you need in terms of, developing the Chinese economy. So that's a very, very normal tension that you can see in many political systems, actually, where the private sector economy gains in importance. So Xi Jinping's answer is, as far as we understand it, to absorb the private sector in a new way. So now they have been becoming much more powerful than they have been back in the 80s and 90s. So you have to use economic means to control the private sector, not only political means, as for instance, the anti-corruption campaign, but also economic means. And that means that you make state-owned companies stronger and you develop trust companies that incorporate many private companies and make them dependent economically, for instance, in terms of credit taking or board of director control, without really interfering too much in what they do on private markets. So it's a matter of control, and control by economic means, which at least is as important as, you know, direct political control via, for instance, anti-corruption campaigns and other measures of political pressure.
As a third question is whether or not more tensions between private entrepreneurs and the party state elites will come in the future. I think this, of course, firstly depends on the domestic and international situation, how it develops, and therefore it's very hard to predict. We have already tensions, of course. On the one side, we have tensions with regard to the more traditional private sector, because currently, or before the corona crisis, the party state was primarily fostering, supporting, and promoting the high-tech sector, and declared sometimes that the low-tech sector, also the labor-intensive sector, will be eradicated with the time. On the other hand, I believe that what is lacking is trust. We had in the last year a survey of a Chinese survey, which found out that more than 60% of the private entrepreneurs are doubtful about the development of the Chinese economy and have no trust in the development of the Chinese economy. And this, of course, should be an alarming figure for the Chinese leadership. And you have even some of the major entrepreneurs who left China and went out to Europe or to the US, and then predicted that the Chinese system would collapse. So I think we have different groups of entrepreneurs. The one entrepreneurs, particularly in the high-tech sector, which currently are rather satisfied with the development and get support by the state from the central and the local level. On the other hand, the low-tech sector, which is curbed, and finally the very small sector, which is has just recovering due to the corona crisis, because the central leadership needs stability and therefore employment.
All right, thank you very much. I just saw where we had already questions in our chat, and I would quickly read them out to you. Tom Hancock asks, did you learn anything about the impact of the post-2013 anti-corruption campaign?
Well, I mean, when we asked our interviewees on their specific situations, I mean, the interview setting was always the same. We tried to find out what were the problems of private entrepreneurs in their specific locality, what kind of demands they would have vis-a-vis the local government, and how would they see the future of the private sector in China. And once we touched on the third question of these, the anti-corruption campaign was always in there. And the private entrepreneurs would utter that they do not feel secure in China, in the sense that there was a so-called 不安全感 in Chinese. So they would feel insecure, even though there were so many years of private reforms in China, that due to the anti-corruption campaign and the new political leadership of Xi Jinping, they were not very confident to what extent the private sector could really prosper. And we found that kind of response across the country, no matter if it was a poorer region or a more developed region. So what Xi Jinping may have achieved is also to bring this kind of, insecurity into that constituency. Insecurity nurtures dependence. And one of the basic rationales of that system is to create insecurity in order to, enhance dependence. And private entrepreneurs feel this very strongly. So they were not very confident on the future. And I just see another chat question. The option to leave China if possible, and only the big entrepreneurs can really think about that, was an option out there, of course, Though the most of the private entrepreneurs in China are not as big as they can seriously ponder the possibility to leave even their locality. So they remain pretty much dependent on the local state, for instance, but also on the central government. On the other side, they are also, as I said, very much responsible of the generation of local taxes. So there is a certain power potential they still have. So it's a very, very sensitive, very difficult relationship.
All right, thank you. We have another very interesting question in the chat, which is from Susanne Weigling-Schiedwitz. She asks, 2 years ago, we had Marxist professors in Vienna who told us that the petty bourgeois needed to be exportionated because they were lawful and exploitative. Do you think that arguments like this have any impact on either the state or the entrepreneurs?
No, actually, in this discourse I have just depicted in the year 2018, when this financial entrepreneur argued on his blog that the private sector should retreat and the state-owned sector should move in. There was among academics a big discussion on this issue, and there was people, about 5 to 10% of the people who were also named from prominent universities, who argued that according to Marx, that the Chinese leadership should get rid of the private sector. But actually, I would argue, on the one hand, the development of the Chinese concept of modernizing until 2050 is dependent on the private sector, because the private sector is currently the sector which is the most innovative and which pays the majority or the largest amount of taxes and provides the largest amount of jobs. So this would it make it extremely difficult, because we all know that the majority of the state-owned sector are not profitable enterprises. And therefore, I don't think that these people or this minority would really get a majority in the public opinion of the Chinese people. But these people still exist. One part of these people, they are still believing in traditional Marxism, and the other part feels that there are too many scandals in which the private sector is involved, and therefore it should be at least curbed, or it should be reduced tremendously.
All right, that's very interesting. Thank you. The next question comes from YSU and asks, are the Chinese private entrepreneurs, medium-sized companies, trying to keep a distance from the state when they expand their business abroad in recent years, or are they more depending on government?
Well, I think I also answered that question in my statement before, that I think for bigger private entrepreneurs, going out is certainly an option, though it's an option for a very limited number in China, to our understanding. So most of the private entrepreneurs would stay put and try their best to maintain good relations with their local government, with their institutional, to impact positively their institutional environment, to keep their business running. Pressure is extremely high. And this also relates to the next question of Joe Schunzel, to what extent this trade war between the United States and China impacts on the political and economic situation of private entrepreneurs in China. What you can observe even before the trade war, and we mentioned that in the presentation, is that the Xi Jinping government tries to absorb the private sector in a new way to drive forward this nationalist project of decoupling to some extent the Chinese economy from the international market. So it's all about, bringing about a domestic innovation economy in order to nurture a strong domestic market. It's also about, a trigger of demand from the domestic market in order to keep the economy running and to reduce dependency on exports. So private entrepreneurs play an important role here, because they are the innovators and they are the driving forces of the domestic market as well. So in a way, you can say that the trade war between China and the United States has pushed that long-term strategy of bringing those relations between the state and the private sector into the next stage of making China great again, right?
Can I add one point? I think, what does it mean, distance from the government? It does not mean that the entrepreneurs won't completely solve themselves from the government, but that they try to solve their entrepreneurial problems, their enterprise problems by themselves. And I think a very good example for it is the credit issues. Since more than 10 years, the Chinese government promises to stronger support the small and medium enterprises by credits and loans from state-owned banks. But since in last June, Li Keqiang once again emphasized this issue. So you can see it has not been solved. There was not much developing process, not much success in order to gain this goal. Therefore, the entrepreneurs try to solve these problems by themselves, by credit associations among their peers, their networks, or even among the entrepreneurs in a given city. In Wenzhou, this is quite prominent. Although organizing this kind of credit associations does not suit to the Chinese legislation because it's forbidden. But they do it because they have no other choice, and the state can only tolerate it.
All right, thank you. I think you already answered the next question, so we can move on to Xuliang Chen's question, which is how about the conflicts between the private entrepreneur strategic group and the public, and the role of the political power in his? There is collusion between the political elite and economic elite. This power relation is damage to the legitimacy and stability of the regime.
Well, it depends on how you look at it. We already said that there is the danger of sort of a crony capitalist relation between political elites and private entrepreneurs. Because if you look at the history of state-business relations in China, the party state nurtured the private sector. Originally, back in the 80s and the 90s, it was mostly party cadres who turned into private entrepreneurs. So there was always a symbiotic relationship between the party on the one hand and private entrepreneurs on the other. And then there was also a lot of collusion there to develop a certain locality. Now, what we see in China today is that there is a second generation of entrepreneurs. It's more or less the second, partly even the third generation of private entrepreneurs coming out there, and they are much more professional in the sense that they have not that background that the first generation had in being very close to the party state, but they are more or less, not independent, of course, but they have a different position because of that changing background, being much more professional entrepreneurs, working in a much more competitive environment, and also vis-a-vis a party state who has, triggered and focused on the erection of private markets over time now. So there is a real shark basin in China for private entrepreneurs to survive. And that forces the private entrepreneurs either, not either, but that forces a private entrepreneur to still work closely together with the local government and to have a position that ensures that his or her economic interests are safeguarded. So again, this is a very sensitive relationship. There is mutual dependency, and that may nurture corruption, but it may also nurture increasing professional relationship in the sense that, they have sort of an interaction that is much more equal. It's much more in the sense that private entrepreneurs know about the potential they have to develop the locality. They may also negotiate on things much better than they could in the past. But again, as Thomas said, the party state knows that and has a keen eye on this development and does not want to lose control over the private sector. And that nurtures this kind of tension that creates this Guanxungan on the part of private entrepreneurs.
All right. We have one or actually several questions from Elisa Jones, and maybe I could just read them out, and I think we still have time to go through them. She asks a clarification question. You alluded to action which furthers a collective interest of private entrepreneurs, which is at the same time uncoordinated. Without coordination of some sort, though, how can collective interests be ascertained? Are you saying that private connective actions allow entrepreneurs to formulate shared strategic priorities, and from there, what they individually take action, e.g. leverage their connections to state representatives to promote agreed upon goals? Can you add some examples?
Yeah, I think one example is, for instance, we found out that in the locations where we conducted fieldwork and by checking in the internet, that in principle, in the people's congresses on the national level, on the local level, on the provincial level, private entrepreneurs rose the same questions which they were interested to solve. That was issues of political protection, of economic protection, of legal protection, the issues of loans, of the issue of the predatory state. All these we found across localities in the entire country. But it was not organized. There was no organization which said the private entrepreneurs should, in these various organizations, digest these issues and bring forward the according motions. And therefore, we found out how to classify this. And I think James Scott, in his book, Weapons of the Weak or Everyday Forms of Resistance, he gives a very prominent issue. What counts is a large amount of people. He was not concerned with China, but with Malaysia, and did research on the weapons of the peasants. When a large amount of people put the same things forward or go in the same direction, this large amount of people, the large number counts. And therefore, this can be classified as collective action. For instance, if the state decides that peasants at the local level should deliver part of their harvest to the state, then the people will declare less of their harvest. If they have to pay taxes according to the land, they will declare less land. And of course, if a large amount of people are acting in this way, then it has an impact on the party state, on the state. And the same we found out, if a large amount of people, of private entrepreneurs, put forward the same motions, the same suggestions, and if they are going to lobby in the same direction, then this has an impact on the policy shaping. This was our basic argument. I think this is a very interesting hypothesis.
May I add a little point to Elisa's question? I mean, we are talking about coordinated action across space and across time. But if you look at a specific locality, for instance, a business association in Guangdong or in Fujian or wherever, then you have also coordinated action. I mean, in the locality we have been to, there is coordinated action through formal and also informal institutions, right? But if you want to have a nationwide significance, then the issue would be to have a nationwide coordination, right? And the Chinese state is very, very touchy on this and avoids organizations of any sort to organize at the national level so that it can exert political influence at the national level. So that's pretty much a corporatist approach still in China. But you have this kind of, we found this kind of strategic collective action in certain localities, and then together with a large number of facts working into the same direction, that's impacting on the political system, of course.
Okay, thank you. We have one question left, which will be the last one before we wrap up. And it is an addition to Xueliang Chen's, and it is, in especially such collusion may hurt the labor right, for example, the Jersey incident in 2018. When there is a more dependent relation between those economic elites and political elites, will it be more difficult to protect labor rights?
Gunther.
Well, you know, I've sensed from these questions that there is a real concern on the part of our Chinese colleagues that the relationship between party state elites and private entrepreneurs is turning out to be very corruptive and also turning out to be an obstacle for a healthy environment of civil society. I find that very interesting because on the one hand, this is a very, this is a very understandable concern for the simple fact that these two groups are probably the most powerful in China, party state elites in their respective vicinities and private entrepreneurs. So the problem is, to what extent can their cooperation edge out all the rest of Chinese society, right? I think this is an observation that we have to make now. We have to follow that. There is no clear-cut answer to this problem at least in my own perspective. We have met so many private entrepreneurs who are pressured so hard, who have to, to live up to a very, very competitive environment, are under a lot of pressure. But then, of course, we also met those big shots who know every party secretary well, who are very well connected, and who can, make use of a lot of privileges. How that turns out in, if you take the whole group across the country, and how that is going to evolve over time with respect to party-state government, party-state business relations, it's very hard to say at this moment. I think what you can say is that, at least to my understanding, the Xi Jinping government is very much aware of the danger of the Chinese economy turning into a crony capitalist economy. And so it maintains a high pressure on private entrepreneurs, because if you lose control over that group, then you may be in a real problem in China.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Dr. Heberer and Professor Dr. Schubert, for your wonderful and very interesting talk. And thank you for the lively discussion and joining the webinar today. This webinar will be available online, and if you'd like to watch it again, you can do so anytime. And Weapons of the Rich is available for sale on World Scientific website. And until the 31st of July, you can get a discount of 40% even by using the code which has just been posted in our chat. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again in one of our next events. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I hope we can get a copy too.
Yeah,
of course. Of course you will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.